We're gathered here today to discuss the book, Black on Both Sides, A Racial History of Trans Identity by C. Riley Snorton. Hey, Jacob, can you wave so that people know who you are?
Hi, I'm Jacob.
And Marissa, will you do the same?
That's me. Hello.
And I'm Sherlanya. I've finally learned to not just like create a moment where it's like, hi, can you introduce yourselves? And then everyone's like, I don't know who you're talking to, though. It only took months to figure this out. So this book was meaty, and I feel like I have a video that explains my experience with this book, and I'm just wondering if you guys felt the same. This book, but before I do that, I think that I want to just start with some facts about this book, right? This book came out in 2017. It's by C. Riley Snorton, who is clear, like if you spent even 2 pages with this book, it's clear that this is a very thoughtful academic who has done a lot of study in areas that have to do with Black studies, gender studies, culture studies. He teaches at the University of Chicago. You know what? Let me stop. Snorton teaches at the University of Chicago. And does work in Black studies, gender and sexuality studies, critical race studies, cultural studies, visual culture, and iconography. When I read that, which I read after I read this book, I was like, okay, that has made all of the pieces snap together for me in a way, right? Because this book is super layered in a very intense way. Like you guys might be in a different boat than I am. But I felt like my brain was getting I felt like my brain tried to go to CrossFit after sitting on the couch for 8 months of pandemic. Like that's what this book felt like to me. And I mentioned that because, that's going to impact the way that our discussion goes, right? And I think that it's an important thing to acknowledge, right? Like not every book is going to be easy and not every book has to be easy. And you don't have to digest everything from a work in order to digest something from the work. So that's sort of the spirit that I'm bringing to the table today. Now, like I said, I'm not going to assume that just because that was my experience, it was your experience. And maybe one of you is just going to really come in here and break it all down.
Not me.
Nope.
That would not be me.
Okay. So I thought that I might talk a little bit about why this book, right? This is probably, I like to do this, but it's probably like even more important, like in an instance where, like I'm alluding to, I clearly bit off more than I could chew here. When I was thinking about the list of books and movies and things to include as a part of this discussion series, I really wanted to make sure that a broad experience was represented, right? Because I think that sometimes it's really easy to hit the greatest hits, right? Like to think about okay, what are the names that I just know off the top of my head and come up with a list right away, right? And I didn't want that because everybody's experience, people share things in their experiences, but things happen to some people that don't happen to other people. And I wanted to get into all sorts of things. And I wanted to expand expand the things that I'm thinking about, read in areas where I have intended to read more, or read in areas that I know that I should read more in. And so that was a selfish reason for choosing it. And then, I knew that I wanted to include something that had to do with the trans experience, in particular, because that's one area where, the last several years have been interesting, right? And I've listened to a lot of our colleagues talk about experiences that they had with their family members around political disagreements and arguments and things that they were seeing, their experiences on social media and stuff. And for me, I was well, that's interesting. And I could see how hurtful it was for a lot of people and what people were going through when they're watching these things, but that's just not an experience that I had. But there is an area where I kind of was watching terrible conversation, terrible from my standpoint, conversations happen. And that was around the idea of Black trans lives mattering, right? And I would watch people who I know, right, be like combative about that matter. And so I was kind of thinking about that too, right? Because I was like, oh, like when I was seeing that, I was like, oh, this is like, I knew in my head how people were feeling when they're watching people that they know express disdain, disrespect, lack of empathy, etc., toward another group. Like I wasn't seeing that until I saw it here, right? And so in that way, I do feel like I had an experience similar to what other people are having. It made me feel like, you know what, you gotta educate yourself a little bit more. You have to like go a little bit farther than just hoping that everybody will be able to find a place where people are treated well, right? And so that was part of my thinking here. But like in choosing the book, I also wanted the book to be written by somebody who identified as trans. And so that's like one of the things that I was looking for. And then like understanding that this is an area where I'm not well read and things. I wanted to seek an authoritative voice, right? Like I wanted to seek a voice that I could see had like done work in this area and like just really knew what subject matter was being covered. And it was important to me that it wasn't an entertainer, because I do think that sometimes when we seek to learn about other people, we look at entertainers in a way that's kind of weird, right? Like, because like you're almost like saying like, I don't think it's wrong to look at entertainers, and I've read books by entertainers, but I do think that when you only seek an entertainer, you're kind of asking a person to be in service to you, right? Like you're kind of saying, that's what it felt like to me. It's like, well, I'm going to listen to you because your job is to entertain me anyway. And I felt very uncomfortable with that. So I explicitly wanted somebody who wasn't an entertainer, right? And that's how we landed on this book that I could barely read. And when I looked at it, because I flipped through the book before I put it on this list, right? Because like I'm like, all right, do I think I'm going to be able to read this? And I must have chosen like the 4 pages that had paragraphs that I was able to read. Because I remember I looked through the book somewhere, and then I ordered the book, and then I flipped through the book when I ordered it, and at that instance, I also thought like, yeah, okay. I was scared this book was going to be too academic, but it's going to be okay. And it must be like the 4 pages that don't have Post-it notes on it. So anyway, I just wanted to share with you guys a little bit like how we got here, of all places. And then for your entertainment, before we get in here, I think I haven't shared a thing in so long. I'm not even sure if I'm going to be able to do it properly.
Well, you're looking for that. I'll say, yeah, this was tough reading. I looked up an interview with them because I was like, maybe in an interview, he'll explain this content in a way that I can understand. And then I was like, oh, he talks like this too.
I started listening to one as well and was like, oh, this is just like reading the book. But it was a little bit nice to like sandwich it. Like, because I was like, you have to finish this book, right? And it was taking so long. I was like, oh my goodness, how can you do it? And then so I did it afterwards and I was like, oh, right. This book took us on a long journey and I almost had forgotten about some of the stuff in the beginning.
Yeah, I read this with a dictionary and multiple times he would mention some person and I was like, I have no idea who this is. I had to Google it. One of my friends is doing a PhD right now in gender studies. And so I messaged him like, have you read this? What are the footnotes? I don't think I'm understanding this book. And even he was like, oh, not his favorite. So,
The PhD said, oof.
Yeah.
Oh.
So so one question I have for you guys, how did that feel reading this book? Like I had a million feelings when I started this book and then I couldn't, it was just hard to get into because I was like, I felt like I had to stop and just be like, wait, this is a time where you have to like ask yourself some questions. Is it the content or are you having some kind of resistance? Like I didn't think I was having resistance, but I also wanted to put the book down. And I was like, oh, did you unearth like maggots under this rock that you thought was just like sitting there? And I just wondered if you guys experienced anything like that.
Something I did not expect to feel. Well, I don't even know what I expect I feel anymore. But when I was reading this, I reflected on my experience as a teacher, where as a teacher, your job is to break down information in a way to communicate it to others so they can learn. And then the things that they learn, what they learn after that is built upon that foundation, right? Mm-hmm. I felt like my foundation was always crumbling. Like I would understand something momentarily and then more information would be piled onto that thing. And under the weight of that new information, my foundation crumbled. I also felt frustrated. Why is this not in language that lay people can understand? What purpose does it serve to write it in a way where the majority of people cannot understand? Academia? That's a gatekeeping scam. that's like,
Did you say a gatekeeping scam?
That's a gatekeeping scam. Like I have to pay $60,000 to figure out how to read this. You know what I'm saying? So I felt a lot of things. I was hungry for the content. I was like, teach me. And of course I did learn things. I just coming at it from that perspective of I don't know who it benefits for this information to be expressed in the way that it was expressed. Does that,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Do I sound bitter? I don't want to be bitter. I guess I am bitter.
Well, I wouldn't have. Well, now that because you said like, I guess I am. Like now, I changed what I was about to say, but I wouldn't have described. Like you just sounded like you had a frustrating experience.
Okay.
Like bitterness and frustration, I don't think are the same.
Yeah, I had a lot of those same feelings too, Jacob. Because I was reflecting a lot about too of like, right, am I just resisting this knowledge? Am I being biased right now? Am I not? And then I was wondering, am I the audience for this book? I'm white, I'm cisgendered, I'm a woman. This is not my experience. Maybe this book isn't for me, and that's okay, but maybe it's just not for me. And then I was thinking too about like, well, but academic language, like this is every other word is these $10 words that I had to look up in the dictionary. And I remember when I was in my master's class, they were basically like, this is how you have to write. You need to throw in your ontology and your whatever and all of these words because you're proving that you can write like this. That's the point of a degree. And there's so much pressure to publish and pressure to like be a certain way. And then having added pressures of being a Black person, being trans, and trying to fight to prove that you belong in academia. Like, I couldn't even imagine that added pressure. And I wondered if that was part of why it was so difficult to read.
I certainly thought about that. I certainly thought about that. I was like, because I was frustrated, because I was like, I just would like to read this, and yeah, I was admittedly, I was feeling time pressure, and I allowed extra time for this. And I was like, you allowed twice as much time to read this book as you have carved out for the others. So I was just like, but then, as I was getting frustrated, I was like, okay, this is a Black trans person who is in academia, and this person is going to have to prove every single bit of knowledge, right? And so like with that, I was kind of reading it through that lens. I was like, well, I just have to trust that Riley Snorton knows what is necessary, because his authors had this author's experience, right? And clearly, it is clear that like this is a matter that has been deeply studied. And it's like, well, sometimes there's information on top of the text. And in reading this text, I felt like it wasn't just thinking about the identities that was making me think about that, but the way that the text was built, right? Because a lot of this book is about like, where is the knowledge, right? There's all this, there are certain things that we think about as like history, as knowledge, as parts of like what is documented, the record. And then there are things that exist that aren't documented in a way. And so like, I felt like I was thinking a lot about that when I was trying to digest the book, but also like what it means for this particular book to exist, what it means for this author to have written this book, and like what information is coming to us from the fact of its being, which is not normally what I'm thinking about if I'm reading something, which I think also slowed the process, right? And then like it even like this book made me think about all sorts of things inside and outside of the book. But, like a lot of what I was frustrated with is just like the time that it was taking. And I think that, part of me was frustrated with myself because I'm like, well, you know what? It takes time to learn new stuff. It takes time. Like if you're thinking about topics, if you're thinking about things through a lens you don't normally look through, it is simply going to take time. And if you want to learn the thing, you need to take the time. However, like usually I'm a very quick reader, and usually I read something and then I've like synthesized it while I'm reading it, and I can confidently like read a thing, go to sleep, wake up ready to discuss like 1,000 elements of it, right? And so like this book challenged that book challenged like how I think of myself as a reader, right? But then like the way that this book is written, it's like, but what else is this challenging about what you think about yourself? Like this, I think that I'm going to be digesting this book for like the YouTuber, like for months, really, in terms of a lot. Like when we think about one of the things I was stricken by, like I don't think that I will ever see the prefix trans like as a prefix, right? Like as a unit that we see in front of so many words ever the same, just because of the way that like words like such as like transitive, transversal, transatlantic were used. Like there's always this pause. And I think that like, while at first I was like, what? I think it was actually quite effective, right? Because I think that there's a tendency to think about, among some people, not among everybody. I think that for like a straight person who hasn't done a whole lot of homework, I think that there's a tendency to think of like LGBT, okay, this is what one thing is, 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 right? But like the nature of, like, as argued in this book, like you can't think about transness like that. There's not like a definition. And I think that like, like the very nature of the prefix means it's moving, right? Like this is a word of movement. This is a word that requires like this. I'm thinking about like calculus, right? Like how if you're looking at a curve, like every single point on that curve is different. And one point on that curve is not the same as another point on that curve, right? And if you're used to thinking about like rectangles and squares, and if you can't stop thinking about rectangles and squares, you're never gonna be able to like step back and understand that each moment in the curve is different. But I don't think that I would have ever even thought about thinking about this in that way without the interplay, like without the use of the word transversal, right? Like without like this term that most of us remember from like geometry. I don't think that I don't believe that ever would have like stretched out the language itself. And I think that it's going to impact anything I read further too.
Well, I think that in itself, that's like a huge thing that you got from this book. Even though it might have been a difficult reading experience, like at least when I hear you say that, I think that's a pretty huge shift in perspective, right?
Mm-hmm.
So even though I might, I'm calling, like, I can't understand this book, there's things that I did understand that changed my perception in that same way. So maybe the conversation surrounding how understandable or not understandable the book, if you learn something, I'm not sure how much me not understanding every single part of the book is important or valid.
Mm-hmm.
One question
right?
I have is like when approaching a book that's like called Black on Both Sides, A Racial History of Trans Identity, what were you hoping to get out of this book? This is a question that I asked myself like 10 pages in when it was clear to me that I had a notion of what I was walking into and that like that is not the door that I actually walked through. So I was curious if you guys had similar experiences, and if so, what did you think that you would walk away with out of this book?
Having the ability to put some pins along the timeline of the Black trans historical timeline. Even to know that there is a recorded history with the newspaper clippings, all sorts of things in this book, that in itself was something I hoped to get out of the book, and something that I did get out of the book in some shape, form, or fashion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's kind of what I was expecting too, was more I guess, snippets of history, or at least some kind of linear, how we think of history normally. And then that first chapter on like the history of gynecology, I had to reevaluate what I was reading. I'm just like, this is not the book I thought I was reading. Yeah.
I felt like this book had quite the cast of characters in a way, right? And I feel like this book had a different cast of characters than I thought that I was going to meet. And this is another way that like this book, I think, this one might not be like as big of a shift in perspective, but I do think that that it turned another light on in a room for me mentally, right? So like I also thought that like I was going to read, I thought that I was going to get like I thought this was going to be like a survey course that was going to tell me like important names, important occurrences, and just give me, I thought that this book was going to give me like what I like to call drawers to put more information into, right? But I also like fundamentally don't think it works that way, right? And so like, why did I want that out of this book when I don't even believe that that's how it works, right? And so like, that's one thing where it's like, oh, okay, like that turned the light, like that was like, it's like, I don't think that that is how things work, but I wanted that, right? And so then that made me, it's just like, okay, you need to take some time and think about what that means, which I have not done yet. But this book reminded me of, in some ways it reminded me of another book in the, well, cast of characters first. That's where it's going. So like I had expected to get like important names when it came to like the story of like Black trans history, but we got everybody else's name in some ways, right? So like we saw Harriet Jacobs, which I was like, hey girl, hey, I just read your story. You know,
I was like, I know you.
yeah. And then like then we, had like we had the gynecology part. I was like, hey, I remember the first context in which I learned about Sims, and that was in a cultural anthropology class that I had that I chose to take as like my race and ethnicity elective in undergrad, right? And it felt like, oh wait, it totally makes sense that like you were reading about the thing that you read about in this cultural anthropology class that was about how that was in part about like the social construction of race. Totally makes sense that you would read it here. You never expected to see it here, right? But like later, like we see a reference to Louis Farrakhan, right? And I was like, oh, I wasn't expecting this aside reference here. We saw a reference to like Tom Joyner, and I was like, oh, okay, I wasn't expecting to read like, so like in some ways when I was reading this book, I was like, this book is like extra Black in a way that is interesting to me, because it is again showing me that like when I'm engaging with this, it's like an ultra academic text. And even though it is specifically about like the trans Black experience, like I am seeing this academic text as like the idea of what I have about an academic text in my mind. But now, Snorton's talking about like Tom Joyner and like talking about Farrakhan's days as a singer before he became who we know him to be now, and talking about like Jet magazine and Ebony magazine and like mentioning all of these things. I was like, it took you like 1,000 pages in to also read this as like a Black text. And what does that say about ideas and biases that you have acquired over the years? Because I was like deep in the book before I was like, this book is like extra Black, right? Because I just wasn't seeing it that way. I wasn't seeing that way until Tom Joyner entered the room. And I was like, okay, all right. Even though we talked about like, even though that was like, after we talked about like, analyzing the souls of Black folk and Up From Slavery and Ex-Biography of a Colored Man, which are like texts that you think of as like Black canon, right? And it's just like, okay, this book turned the light on in the room of like how you categorize different things and how you're not tagging everything with all of the tags that it needs to have.
Mm-hmm.
This book made me also think harder about, again, like when the argument is made that it made me think about gender roles differently. Like just in a way I simply hadn't considered. Like if we return to the Harriet Jacobs narrative, I remember reading about, her dressing up as a man in order to be able to move around, but I never would have thought about that. Like if you said like quick, kind of 30 minutes, not 30 minutes, quick in 30 seconds, write down everything that you think of if you think about a Black trans experience. I never would, like the Jacobs thing never would have occurred to me. But like, why wouldn't it though? You know, like if we think about like what gender actually is, right? Like a set of ideas that are applied to somebody, you know, as a set of ideas is what gender is, set of ideas. If you're like transversing the line around those ideas, you know, this book suggests that that is a trans experience, right? In some way, right? And so it just really like exploded the way that I think about gender, like not even necessarily, it just made me think a lot about how fuzzy those edges really are.
And yes, okay, I have to ask the question, or rather, I would just like to posit, if you will. That's a $10 word. I'm going to posit Harriet Jacobs dressing up as a man in order to escape certain abuses, traumas of the experience of her life. That is a different thing than being a trans person.
Yes. But being a trans person, I think, is a different thing than a trans experience, right? Because like if part of what a trans experience is to be able to move freely and operate freely and be what you need to be, then having this experience in order to move into an state of being where you can be free, I think is a trans experience.
Wow.
This book makes me think about that, right? Like I think that and I think that this book talks about different types of things. Like in the latter half of the book, what the book is talking about is much closer to, I think, what I would have expected to read about when I picked up the book, right? Like that's more about people who, you know, the time, like it's like these places, some of these incidents took place like in the 50s and stuff like that. So I'm very, again, like having done, like being out of my depth in terms of like knowledge about like cultural markers and things like that. Like, I don't know how these folks would identify or not, but I do know that like these identities or like words are constructed in some ways to box people, right? Like, I don't know that the people that we read about in 1950 would have used the language that we're even attempting to use right now, right? Like the one person was saying, I'm bad at remembering names, but there was one person who, you know, police were harassing the person, and it's like the person said, so they were asked, are you a man or something like that, and the response was like, if I am, I don't know it. You know, and like that felt like somebody just living and not engaging with being named. But I think that this book also talks about or makes us engage with like, what does it mean to be named and who is doing the naming? Like, I think that that's a really big question in this book. Who is doing the naming? Who is doing the categorization, right? Because there was a quote toward the beginning of the book that made me think, I think it was like in the introduction when I was taking a lot of notes and I was like, I can't keep this up. But, you know, it's talking about how academic study requires certain things, you know, requires transparency, I think. And then it asks, like, what about the right to opacity? You know, and it's just like, for me, it called into question, like, well, you want to know some things, but what is it that's yours to know? And what is it that's not yours to know? And if your reason for knowing or your reason for wanting to know, which for me is like I just fundamentally want to be like respectful to people, right? And if I need to learn more things in order to do that better, like, that's what I want to do. Right. Like, but it's also like, well, you maybe don't get to decide what it is that you get to know. And you just need to like figure it out and do your best to be like the person you're trying to be. Like do your work, but like also accept. I mean, that's me like chewing on it and like walking away with what I took from it. Like, I don't necessarily think, I'm not suggesting that that particular thing is an argument, but it really made me think about it. Or even James Baldwin, I was reading something in passing, and in the way that he was responding to something, it was just like the answer wasn't real like cut and dry. That's what the answer was, real like when he was talking about something about his own and this is I'm jumping subjects, but the idea about like what's yours to know and what's not to know is what I'm thinking about in making this jump. But he was just like, well, that essentially he's like, the question that you're asking me is not the way that I'm even thinking about this. You know, and it's like fair. Like, I don't know. That was very meandering. But you know, when you're still trying to digest, it's gonna happen.
Yeah. I forget exactly how you said it, but yeah, the first half of the book, it's the whole book is setting some context for what is trans, and it totally did redefine what trans means in this. Like when you're talking about what I expected from this book, I expected it to be more about how we think of transgender and being transgender, which first of all is impossible to know because those things weren't written down and it was a long time, like, but so then the whole first part of the book where he's talking about how Blackness is ungendered, like that concept, like I'm still chewing on it because I had such a reaction to it. It was like people, but they still had gender, like all of this stuff, and some of it was not even necessarily written down, I think, because he's assuming a smart audience, and there's a lot of assumptions I think that he's maybe making about the audience, but because I was thinking too, like people in Africa had gender roles and they were stolen and brought here and then forced into different gender roles. But then even that, he talks about how slaves didn't have the privilege of rigid roles, which I thought was really interesting, that I had never, I'm still chewing on that too, and what that would mean. And then I think that then led into the cross-dressing to escape slavery. It just, there's a lot woven in and out. But yeah, the whole context, and then setting that as the context of if Blackness is ungendered, how does that set a context for the latter half of the book? Was interesting and totally radically different than what I was expecting.
Yeah, it's an interesting way to think about like what like thinking about like this idea, right? Like this idea that was created that was like, okay, Black people, flesh, right? Like, and like separating the physical being from, like, I feel like I almost, like when I was reading that stuff, the stuff that you're talking about, like it almost made me think of like a body as the flesh part, and then like some bodies within the context of the society that he's describing here. So like American society as it's developed, it's like some bodies get to put on get to like step into a gender suit, and others don't. Like that's how, but what that does is it like shows you that it's like a metaphorical suit that is put on and put off. And so like it really illustrates like, well, different people are going to put on this thing. It's not innate. It's what it's it's something that like you apply and then we name it as if it's like this like immutable thing, right? But like he makes the argument that it's not, right? And so it's just a very because we've all heard like gender is a culture, it's a social construct, right? Like you hear that, but I feel like this book like illustrated it through this treatment through like walking you through the way that some bodies were treated as gendered bodies, right? Like with the rules, like you couldn't possibly look upon it, right? Like you couldn't possibly have this person who gets to have gender unclothed, because like that's not how that works, right? But like this person stripped of the gender, like you do whatever you want. And that was interesting. But I think the other thing that it does is like shows that it's like a step-by-step constructed, right? And one of the places where that really stood out to me was when Sims was taking what he learned when he did all those inhumane experiments on all of the enslaved women, the few who are named and then the half a dozen more or whatever. Like I always find it interesting when we see winks of the acknowledgement that what was going on was wrong and the people knew it, right? So, which I'm always fascinated by, because I feel like some of the ways we talk about history, it's like, oh, well, that's, that was what happened before, and then people have evolved and we don't think this way anymore. And it's like, but there is evidence all over the place that people absolutely knew that what was happening shouldn't happen, right? So like at first, Sims had people who were helping him, and then people were like, nah, man, this is not cool, and I don't want to even be associated with that, right? Or the fact that the fistulas would be described as like an accident when really it was like a result of the conditions of slavery, right? So like when it's being called an accident, that is an acknowledgement that like they knew that what was happening to these people's bodies as they were being sexually exploited, they knew it was wrong, because if they didn't know it was wrong, they wouldn't have to call it an accident. They would have had a different way of talking about it, right? But the one that stood out to me the most was like when he took this knowledge and then he was applying the knowledge to a white woman somewhere, and it went poorly because he had given her anesthesia. And I was like, see, you knew that this is a painful thing. You're pretending, you're suspending something here. Like you don't even know how to use anesthesia properly, because you don't use it on the people that you've used, the commodities that you've abused. You don't even know how to treat this other person correctly because you don't do it over here. And I think that that's interesting to just to watch it jump off of the page. Let's see, I'm gonna consult my cards. The other question that this book really made me think about, particularly in the chapters about Sims's experiments, or a question that I wrote down as I was reading, just about all of that like experimentation and the detail that we were exposed to in this book, is just like, what are we willing to do, and what are we willing to allow to happen to other people's bodies when we think it's just not going to happen to our own. And I think that that's an idea that definitely applies to the way that we as straight people can think about trans bodies in a way, right? Because like I don't think that this is untrue all the time. I think that there are certain ways that like people do like think about other people's bodies, but like I think that like in popular culture and popular reading, the way that we think about trans people's bodies is like ridiculous. It's like if you like, whose body are you even considering? And if you thought that that level of consideration would be turned on you, would you even allow yourself that thought? And I think that that is a good way to think about things. Like if you thought that what happened to children's bodies at the border could happen to your own child, how does your response look? You know, how is your response differently? Or for some people, if you thought what happens to, you know, Black children's bodies when they're just trying to like go to the convenience store and get some Skittles, if you thought that was could happen, if you could imagine that that could happen to your child's body, how is your response different? And this something that Snorton wrote just cracked that open in that you know, when he was talking about Dr. Sims's experiments.
Mm-hmm.
What questions did this book make you guys think about?
I think and a reason why I was eager to come to this discussion is the chapter specifically about kind of the fungibility of Black bodies during that certain historical context.
Mm-hmm.
That's the thing that I was like, I think I'm the closest to understanding, but I want to hear my friends talk about it so I can know more. Can I just like say what I think I learned, and then you guys can be like, it's this idea that like because Black bodies were seen as chattel, as property, and because property is something that can be replaced, that notion somehow plays into the fungibility of gender when it comes to Black bodies. Huh?
I think so, right? Because like if there's this argument that like these people are not people but things, right? Because it's one of the ideas expressed through the fungibility, right? Like if you're applying like this notion of fungibility to an individual, it's like thingifying the person, right? So like it's a thing, right? Like and there's like this interchangeability that comes with, and I think that with that in mind, then you know, like if you don't look at a thing the same way that you look at a person. You glance at a thing. Like when's the like did you really consider the gallon of milk that's in your refrigerator? No, because like it's a gallon of milk. It serves its purpose. It's the thing. I mean, like I feel like I do that with grocery. Grocery is a good example of that, right? Because sometimes you don't even take a good look at the thing. And you get it home, you're like, oh, 2 of these eggs are broken because I didn't look at the thing. I didn't even look at it. I just took it and then discovered something later, right? So like if you're not looking at the thing, you know, thing as in like I'm saying thing right now intentionally, right? Because fungibility implies, like as used here, implies like that the person is not a person, but indeed an object, indeed a thing. You're not ever looking at it. And so then like there is this additional interchangeability, right? And so like I feel like this raises a question, like if these people were looked at as humans, as individuals, as opposed to like just another one of, you know, just another gallon of milk, would this condition where people were able to use ideas around gender to like slip past people and use the rules that come with gender to slip past, would that even be possible if they had ever been seen, right? Like there's like almost an invisibility here. Oh yeah, Invisible Man came up in this book, another like cast of character, but like there's this invisibility, I think, that created this possibility, which is interesting. Or even and that reminds me of the Harriet Jacobs book, right? Because there was a part where she had dressed up the way that she had dressed up, and she said that she passed Mr. Sands, the man who she had a baby with, close enough to reach out and touch him, and he had no clue that she was there, right? And it's like, okay, this is somebody that like you were intimate with and you can't even see them because they look a little bit different. Like that is telling you like how seen, you know, the person was.
And you're saying that in that situation, Harriet Jacobs was able to, I don't want to say she was able to pass, but they were able to, the person they had a child with couldn't even notice them because they do not notice Black bodies as people. They notice them as things. So when Mr. Sands was walking by the mother of his child, he didn't see a Black man. He didn't see a Black woman. He saw something that is fungible.
Yeah, probably didn't even look. Mm-hmm. Probably didn't even take a look. Yeah, because he saw like this object. And then with her, like one of the things that I thought was very interesting in this book, this is one of the other things that I'm always fascinated by. And like if we return to primary sources sometimes, or like this kind of text that is like relying heavily up where you can see the footprint of the primary sources in the research. But, you know, we like when you create systems that like oppress some people and like elevate other people, there's a lot of suspension of like reality that happens in order to make it so, right? And so like one of the things, you know, that people could tell themselves about enslaved people is like, well, they're really dumb, right? Like there's like this idea, but like you watch the very sophisticated ways that folks who had like no access to education and like were deliberately you know, part of the system of slavery is to try to keep people, try to rob people, try to deprive people of like the acquisition of knowledge, right? But like these folks are like demonstrating like, nope, I'm watching this, and like in addition to like whatever hard labor they have to do, whatever abuse that my body is taking, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, I have made enough observations to know what I need to do in order to move through society. And I think that we see that with Harriet Jacobs and with the couple that we saw in the chapter, who the woman was not literate, and she was dressed as a man. And so to disguise the illiteracy, she had her hand bandaged because that would be like why she couldn't write, right? When he, as like a white man traveling with a slave, would have been expected to do like that. That's very sophisticated, right? Like thinking about like what you're going to encounter in this world that you have not seen. But like your observations of what you know, like you're thinking it out well enough to move through, right? Like because like everybody's hyper visible to you. Like if people have control over your lives where they just might kill you, right? You have to observe, you have to understand, you have to know all of the things. And I think that where we see it with Harriet Jacobs is, you know, Snorton points out that she darkened her complexion to move about, and nobody would have guessed that she would have done that. Like in the book itself, there are a lot of when she was a fugitive, you know, the descriptions of her, you know, talk about her fair complexion, talk about her hair, how it's like naturally curly, but it can be brushed straight. And it said that her slaveholder was like, she'll probably be trying to pass for white. She understood that that's what people would have expected her to do. And she also understood that within the color hierarchy, nobody would have assumed that she would attempt to pass for somebody darker skinned, because like that's unfathomable. Like if whiteness is the best possible thing that you can have, nobody, not even a light skinned Black person, right, would even like sully themselves to pass as somebody darker, right? But she had this very sophisticated understanding of the world around her, which is what allowed her to move through in part. And the fact that like nobody around her would have been able to conceptualize, like they would have been stuck in like the racism that like would make it impossible to imagine that she would pass for like a darker Black person, and stuck in the racism that would allow them to think that she could come, despite her having escaped at all, despite her being clever enough to escape, that she would be clever enough to like trick again, you know? And that's interesting, right? But then I think that we can apply like this type of thinking to some of the way that we watch people talk about people identify as trans people. Oh, this person must be confused. Why would you think that somebody was confused? Why would you think a group of people, why would you think that a single set of ideas would apply to a group of people? Because you do not see these people as people, you know, like you would,
wow.
You know, like anytime you're like saying a thing like that, well, this person must just need blah, 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 blah. Something must have triggered this in this person, blah, blah, like all of these ideas that one hears when people are trying to like legislate people out of their rights, out of their human rights, are all like this experience of like of not seeing people. That was a deep sigh, Jacob.
I'm chewing on it. I'm like, ooh, yeah. I'm thinking and chewing.
You're just expressive, and it allows me, like when I pick on stuff like that, I'm like, okay, this is going to give me a nice time to look through my cards.
Okay, and I'm so done being expressive. I wish I could just be like,
no, it's lovely.
Yes.
It's my goal every day. Shalanya, know what I'm thinking immediately.
Yes. But I guess when you were discussing that, a thought that I had was like, so the idea that gender is fungible. Harriet Jacobs used both her feminine wiles and she also performed masculinity to get different things. Mm-hmm. And that in itself, and when I look at it from one angle, is proof that gender roles exist, because she abused and manipulated them and tried them on in different ways to get things that she needed. But it also, when you look at it from another angle, shows that it is, in fact, something that is fungible or replaceable, or is just a thing that you can take on and off and put on. And do you see what I'm trying to get at?
I think like what you made me think is like, or you could see it as a tool, right? Like it can be a tool that like you can figure out how to use, or it can be a tool that can be used against you, right? Like it can be whatever. I mean, like this book made me think about just the different way that we, like anybody, I shouldn't even say, nope, let me back up, because I'm like, I am distancing myself from what I really mean. And so I'm going to call myself on my own BS right now and say what I mean. This book made me think about certain ways that I have played with the idea of gender in my own head and in my own way that I think about things in my own life. And there's one prime example of it. Like, yeah, you guys know that, like, you know, I spent like the vast majority of my time with my son as a single parent. And like, I absolutely on many occasions have thought like, I am the man of this house. I am I am the man of this house. Because like when you think about what a man of the house does, provides, you know, keeps the joint safe, kills the bug that the 6-year-old is afraid of, you know, make sure that the lawn is taken care of,
Yep.
make sure that, you know, make sure like smells that smell and was like, oh, that's coolant. I got to find the source of the leak. I am the man of this house, and you cannot tell me that I am not the man of the house, period. Like that is like one place where like, and, you know, I am not arguing that that's any kind of trans experience. Like, but that is definitely an example of gender ideas being something that just you can take it on and put it off, you know, like it's, or like, yeah, here's another minor example of that. One time in undergrad, I did something stupid. Like I did something, I was in a well, I don't want to tell too much of the story because it's like, why? But I was in a conversation with this guy, and I did something. I did something jerky, and he was like, "You asshole," and I was like, "I like the asshole," and he did not call me a bitch. Like I felt like I was like, "That's," you know, it was a very like I felt, you know, he's talking to me as an equal right now, and I like it. I wish more people would call me assholes. And just like reading about like how like some of the rules, think about gender as a set of rules, in some ways a set of ideas that you know, and it can vary, right? Like, so like when you think about it as a set of ideas, like that sort of thing can vary from culture to culture and stuff like that. But it just made me think about the ways that I have applied the idea of like gender or something that you can input off in small ways, just in the day to day. Because I'm telling you guys, the last 12 years, you cannot tell me that I'm not the man of my house. Because I, you know, don't even.
Okay.
And there's somebody who I know who gets upset every not Valentine's Day, who gets upset every Mother's Day because not Mother's Day, every Father's Day, because he sees people saying to women, single parents, Happy Father's Day, and he gets really upset about it because because you never see people do the same thing. Telling single men Happy Mother's Day on Mother's Day. And I was like, but that, like, always think about that. And I was like, that is because we valorize men differently than we do women. Like he sees that as like people not, you know, he's like, I look at that and I was like, you are very upset that that people dare think belongs to men and men only. I don't believe for a moment that you want somebody to tell you Happy Mother's Day. I think that you are interested in preserving like your idea of manhood, and you're not actually interested in the interplay that you suggest that you're interested in. It's something in his tone. I can't, but I see it every year, and I was like, oh, here comes the thing where he's going to be super upset about it. You know, it's like, don't worry about what does it have to do with you though? Like, why are you so upset about this? And there's something about the tone and like the level of like, this has been going on for years. And it's like, I would never expect somebody to say like Happy Father's Day. It's like, I don't need you to tell me Happy Father's Day because I already know I'm the man of the house. Like, I don't need to be the father. I'm not the father. I'm just the man. Like, that's it, you know. Anyway, that was all over the place. But this book specifically, one of the questions I had on one of the cards was like, this book made me ask myself in a different way, like, who even is a woman? Right? Like gender and like around the gynecology thing. It's just like, just to even look at that question and ask it directly. I don't know how to answer that question. Like when faced specifically with that question and actually thinking about it, I don't know what the answer to that is. I don't know how to answer that question. And like part of me is like, I don't know. Why do I even need to know? Like that's like, but like, what does that even mean? It made me think about, it's like, oh yeah, this is not like, and this is certainly not a new idea. And it's certainly an idea, like, it makes me think about the anti-woman speech, right? It's just like, oh yeah, these notions here, this is making me think about a time specifically where, the speaker is like questioning, asking like, hey, excuse me? Like, why am I excluded from that? And so it's just like, who makes me ask, who is a woman? And like, when is it and when is it not something that is like a desirable label? But I kind of think about that around other, like I had a similar set of thoughts around the idea of like, who is a feminist, right? Because like that's a term that I personally have trouble with, because it's like I think about it and I think in my mind there's certain kind of women that I think about and I was like, yeah, I'm not you, so that's not me, right? But it's like sometimes when you face some of these terms that function as a stand-in for different things at different times, it's like, oh yeah, this moves. Oh yeah, this is a fungible concept. No, or like.
And I think that when it comes to like Gen Z, those questions you're asking, like, what is a woman exactly? What is a feminist exactly? I think that the little youngins, Gen Zers, are asking similar questions. So that's something that's exciting to see. At least when I worked with kids, that's something that I was kind of echoed back towards me. But okay, so when you were talking, like we're able to talk about, when we talk about gender, we're not, just because we're talking about gender doesn't mean we're talking about transness. And just because we're talking about transness doesn't mean we're talking about gender. So like we're
correct.
Using like,
and I think that's one of the arguments of this book though. Because exciting. In the first, like when Snorton is talking about when he's talking about like in the first part of the book where he's talking about the experiments, he's not talking about transness. He's talking about gender. Like there's like he's not talking about, like when he's talking about transness, he's talking about it as this idea like of this like I don't have his words, but like all I could do is this. Because right. He's talking about a movement in some ways, right? Like,
well, and there is a part, I think it's like very early on in the book where he talks about transness not as a gender identity, but from an analysis of power. And it's something like the queer politic based on analysis of power, not just about your identity. It's also about power, which I thought was really interesting. I'm not
sure. Isn't gender and sex about power?
Certain that I know what it means, but like maybe 80% there.
No, I totally hear you. It is an important line to delineate only because when I said that Harriet Jacobs used gender as a tool, that's when my brain went red flag and was like, but transness, at least in 2021, is not a tool. It's not something that you wield to do something.
I hear what you're saying.
And I think that thought is dangerous, and it's a thought that is echoed by the same people who say people are trans so they can go up in the bathroom and do whatever up in the public bathroom. So something that I've experienced in this text is like my modern understanding of transness, which has so many holes, is often in direct combat, if you will, with some of these deeply layered and complex ideas expressed in the book. And that made the experience, it even complicated my reading experience further.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But I think he's asking us to hold multiple thoughts in our hand at once. Mm-hmm. You know, and I think that we have to do that, like hold the multiple thoughts or like I just think that we have to like hold that messy handful of stuff. But like I think that like that statement also is just like that might just be me trying to put this book into the way that I think about history, right? Because like there are multiple thoughts that can be true at the same time. For example, like Thomas Jefferson can be a racist and a genius at the same time. Thomas Jefferson can be somebody who like saw great possibilities for what rights could be for people and somebody who absolutely turned around and subjugated a bunch of folks. Thomas Jefferson can be somebody who will free his offspring at the end of their lives, but will not free the person who made those offspring for him, right? Like all of those things can be true at the same time, even though they feel like if you look at a person or if you look at like an idea of a person, they feel like they can't be true at the same time, but they absolutely can, you know what I mean? And I think that this text is asking us to telling us like, listen, this is not, I think this text is telling us like, you can't put things in boxes and you certainly can't put trans ideas around what transness is and can be. It can't mm-hmm. live in a box.
Sure. I
think
I see what you're saying.
That's part.
And
but again, you know, we are all, you know, we all bring our own stuff to a text, right? And like, I know that I'm bringing the way that I think about history and the way that I think about, you know, like you could be friends with somebody who, you know, has some messed up views about something, you know what I mean? Like that can be true at the same time, you know, but it feels like it can't be true at the same time. You know, like you can love that relative and hate everything that they stand for at the same time, but it feels like you can't. And some people would say that you can't. Some people would say like, you don't love me as your friend who belongs to this group that your dad hates if you still express your love to him, right? Like some people will absolutely say that, right? But like that person can, you know what I mean? That person can love their parent and love whoever the person that their parent expresses hatred for at the same time, because it can hold the different ideas, you know, at the same time. But it's brain breaking to think about too, right? Because you're like, no, I want to understand this person. And if I understand this person, how can I rationalize these things that don't feel like they go together? Mm-hmm. Question mark. So that's how I felt when I tried to read. Don't laugh at me, but please go ahead and laugh at me. But this is how I always felt when I tried to read like, oh God, this is embarrassing. But when I was trying to read the Federalist Papers and then like trying to figure out like, because you know they're written by multiple people, and then like I'd be like, wait, who wrote this? And like the ones that James Madison would write weren't always in agreement with each other. But until I understood that that's part of how he thought, like, all right, you gotta run this argument to the ground. Like I was just like, I don't understand, because I had my eye on the wrong question. Ooh. Right? Like if I was looking at it as like a body of work that was meant to think about the ideas that these people were thinking about, it never mattered who wrote what one, right? Because it's like people who are writing about these ideas. But when I was thinking about the fact that I knew that, you know, James Madison wrote some of them and somebody else wrote some other one. And, you know, like when I had my eye on the wrong ball, I was just falling flat on my face on the court, and I couldn't I mean, I literally remember sitting in the basement of Espresso Royale on State Street having that experience. Like, I don't know what this means. I don't know what to highlight. I don't know what I'm supposed to take away because I simply had my eye on the wrong ball. And so like that's a question that I bring to things like, do I even have my eye on the right ball here? Am I even showing up with the right ball to play the game that, like, am I on the basketball court with the tennis ball right now? Could be true, right? But I don't know. I just think that this is asking us to think about a lot. One thing that this book made me think about, this book made me feel the same way that I feel every single solitary time I have tried to read anything about Afrofuturism. And I told somebody that yesterday, and then I got to the end of the book and saw a reference to Sun Ra. And I was like, oh my God, you don't understand, but maybe you do. Because like Afrofuturism, you know, one of the things I have finally gleaned, but barely, because I just cannot even, is like the idea of like these, the idea of like possibilities that like are like these people, these writers imagine possibilities that don't exist in the way that we normally are thinking about things. And they're arguing that you must think about these possibilities in order to like move out from underneath the things that like smash us, right? And I think that there's some of that going on in here, right? Like with the imagined story of the life of Philip, somebody, you know, like when Snorton is like, all right, so like this is not usually what academics do, but I'm going to like imagine this story that was untold. And I think that these two ideas, right, of stories untold are like pulling on each other throughout the text. Because like Snorton specifically makes reference to like, I can't remember the language used, but like, and well, in some ways, like the way that like, that one has to try to construct, well, let me back up. Like, Snorton made me think about like Black genealogy, right? Like you're not going to be able to, you're not going to be like, in many cases, you're not going to be able to just like walk up your family tree because like that data just wasn't collected in certain ways. But like what you can do is like go up and out and around and up and out and around and then come back and then come back and excuse me, and then come back and like take little pieces and like hold on to it and then like weave it back. And I think that that's like this link that's being made, but I think that that's why some of the more uncomfortable notions are a part of it too. Like how do you reach out and out and out and up and up and up to come back to the story that you're thinking about? Question mark.
And something that you said, I had an epiphany. And it's like, oh, okay. Well, I'm going to try this out really quick. When I had certain questions and certain demands of this text, I said, I want to know these things. Tell me these things. And by asking that question, I built a box. And C. Riley Snorton said, my answer doesn't fit in your box. And I said, well, I just don't get it. And from your experience reading the Federalist Papers, having that reaction to this text, now I'm okay. I just had to express that.
It's a lot. There's a lot in here. As the YouTuber we saw, like thick. But I just love the use of the word thick in there. Yeah.
Yeah. When I was young and I saw this was only 200 pages and was like, great, I can bang this out, no problem.
I'm gonna fly through it.
Like 3 hours later and I'm still in the introduction. Like, oh no.
So who knew we were going to like have such a long conversation about a book that we had such a hard time with? I told and obviously like I'm thinking of this as like the end part and not as something that's going to be like included in the actual recording. But I told Eric, I was like, yeah, have a discussion. It'll probably be about 30 minutes because it's that book I've been talking about and nobody like really was able to get in, I think. And I think it's fascinating. Like in that way, I think that Snorton was successful, right? Because like, because this experience was like, oh, no. You're not going to walk into this doorway and have one thought and think that you are done. And my book will not check your little box. If you want to engage with my book, you're going to be thinking about this book for years. Okay. And so like in that way, I think this book might have been like challenging, but like super successful. Like I won't be able to read stuff the same way. And like, it's certainly like, if I am looking at something that has to do with, like, if I come across something that has to do with like somebody's lived experience, I'm certainly going to be thinking more explicitly about how constructions of race are impacting upon that lived experience. Right. And I feel like the end of the book really put that in. So like I have a little thing that I thought would be funny when I thought that we weren't going to have a lot to talk about. But one of the questions that this book made me ask is like, when is it that we're looking for understanding, and when are we looking for understanding, and when do we conflate understanding with a sense of ownership, right? Because like sometimes you want to learn something and then like you want to like have the knowledge that you learned, right? Like you want to own the knowledge that you've learned, and like and sometimes just something might be outside of feeling that mastery or feeling that ownership. And it was making me think about when do we expect to own a thing when we learn about it? ? I don't know what the answer to that is, but and like I said, like eventually I got a certain point through the book and I was like, oh yeah, this is a super Black book. Like there are references left and right that I'm like, okay, right. I know who you're talking about. Yes, I see. Oh, you're making whatever. I was like, I definitely see where this book would have been the book that you read in the Black Studies class and not necessarily in the course that wasn't cross-listed as like Black Studies or whatever. But did you guys see, I can't remember his name, but it's a car salesman in Baton Rouge, Louisiana.
Where the money resides?
Yes. Okay. Did you see the other guy who tried to, the other car salesman, the white car salesman who tried to do the same thing?
Nope.
And you're just laughing considering that notion, because where the money resides, like you hear it is in your brain forever. You're like, that was creative. Get that man a deal of some sort. And I love that guy. That's why he's selling those cars, right? Because he clearly has like this radiant personality that people want to be around, right? But then somebody else saw it and they're like, that's great. I'm going to do it and I'm going to sell some cars. But when you look at what the other guy did, it is clear that he had no understanding of what was actually functioning. He like went through the motions, but he had zero understanding of what was happening, but he felt like he should just own it, right? And then it made me wonder, you're laughing because this is so hard. Marissa, did you see where the money resides? Okay, we're going to change that right now. We are going to change that right now. And Jacob, you're going to be in.
This is going to be stuck in my head all day. And I'm glad. It's where I want to go.
I feel like it's a good, we worked very hard this afternoon and I feel like it's going to be a good, all right. So I'm going to show both.
Okay.
Well, also, I love how you just described, you just described Melania Trump too. But that's neither here nor there. Like to a T, like you could just replace it with Melania Trump. At any rate.
All right. Let's see. And we should probably just stop the recording.